Welcome to the Veil of Truth, your gateway to uncovering hidden insights and illuminating mysteries. I'm thrilled you've joined our global community. Whether you're watching from a bustling city skyline or a quiet countryside, we're glad you're here. Globe showing Europe, Africa, so tell me, where are you tuning in from today? Chapter 1, The Gathering at Waverly Grange. Hercule Poirot, that most particular of gentlemen, was not usually a man for country weekends. He preferred the order and polish of London, the conveniences of his flat, and the company of his little grey cells. Yet, when the invitation arrived, he felt a tug of curiosity he could not deny. The envelope was heavy, cream-coloured, addressed in a precise military hand. Inside lay a single sheet bearing the request. My dear M. Poirot, it would give me great pleasure if you would join a small reunion of friends at my home, Waverly Grange, next Friday to Sunday. It has been many years since we gathered, and I should like the occasion marked with distinction by your presence. You are a man I greatly admire, and though our circle is intimate, I feel certain you will be most welcome. Yours sincerely, Arthur Lytton, Colonel Lytton. Poirot read the lines twice, his moustaches quivering. A reunion? A private gathering? He wondered why his presence was required. I, Hercule Poirot, am not a mere decoration for the dinner table, he murmured aloud in his cosy sitting room. Non, there is something more beneath this, I am convinced. Nevertheless, he accepted. For one thing, he held an admiration for discipline and precision, qualities Colonel Lytton had demonstrated in the army. For another, Poirot's vanity was not untouched by the thought that his presence might indeed mark the occasion with distinction. The journey to Sussex was damp and uneventful. Rain streaked the train windows, and a thin mist clung to the hedgerows as the motor car conveyed him from the station to Waverly Grange. At last the house appeared through the grey haze, a solid Georgian structure, dignified though slightly weather-worn. Its windows gleamed faintly in the dim light, and smoke curled from the chimneys in a manner both inviting and faintly ominous. The door was opened by a maid in neat uniform, and Poirot stepped into the wide entrance hall, where his host awaited him. Poirot, boomed Colonel Lytton, extending a hand of firm grip. He was a tall man, shoulders still square despite his years, his grey moustache bristling like a soldier on parade. Most grateful you could come. Most grateful indeed. Poirot inclined his head. It is I who thank you, Colonel. Your letter intrigued me greatly. I am always pleased to meet the friends of a man I esteem. Capital. Come along then, let me introduce you. The drawing-room was bright with firelight and conversation. For other guests turned their heads as Poirot entered, and Colonel Lytton made the introductions with the crispness of a roll call. First was Margaret Denham, a widow of perhaps 50, elegant in black silk, with a manner both gracious and sharp. Her dark eyes lingered upon Poirot with curiosity, and she extended a hand gloved in grey. Monsieur Poirot, how charming to meet you. I have read of your exploits, though I confess I doubted such things truly happened outside novels. Poirot bowed slightly. Ah, madam, it is always thus. Life, it is the greatest dramatist. Next was Dr. Henry Cross, a tall, angular man with spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose. His face was lean, almost ascetic, and his handshake was cool. Detectives, he said with a dry smile, thrive where doctors fail. Let us hope you are here merely as a guest, and not in your professional capacity. Poirot's eyes twinkled. Let us hope, indeed. Edward Vale followed, a barrister by profession, shorter than the others, plump and cheerful, with eyes that darted like quicksilver. He clapped Poirot on the shoulder in a manner Poirot found a trifle familiar. We've heard of you, sir. Oh yes. If half of it's true, I should think we'll have to behave ourselves or risk being unmasked as villains before dessert. Poirot permitted a small smile. It is always good when friends fear nothing, save a good detective. Lastly came Clara Finch, a nervous little woman in her early 40s, dressed plainly, her hands clasped as though to still their trembling. Her voice was hesitant when she greeted Poirot, yet her eyes searched his face as if seeking comfort. It is an honor. Truly. Poirot bowed again, gentlest with her. The honor, madam, is mine. They gathered about the fire, glasses in hand. The Colonel, standing squarely upon the hearthrug, presided over the company. Conversation soon turned to reminiscences of their youth, Cambridge days, debates fought with passion, friendships sealed with promises. Laughter rippled, but Poirot, who prided himself on observing what lay beneath laughter, felt a tension threading the air. Margaret laughed too quickly, her hand tightening on her glass. Dr. Cross corrected details of old stories with pedantic sharpness, as though determined to assert authority. Edward Vale jested loudly, but his eyes flicked about, measuring reactions. Clara spoke little, but when she did, her words burst forth and then halted, as though she feared to reveal too much. And Colonel Lytton, though he kept up the jovial tone, carried a weight. Poirot noted it most clearly when the Colonel paused by the mantelpiece. A letter lay there, a single sheet folded in its envelope. For a moment, as the others laughed, the Colonel's gaze fixed upon it. His hand trembled slightly as he snatched it up and thrust it into his pocket. Poirot, discreetly watching, filed the detail away. Dinner was served with admirable precision, soup of clear broth, pheasant with red currant jelly, and a fine pudding. Poirot ate sparingly, enjoying more the arrangement of the dishes than the dishes themselves. He admired order, and the butler executed his duties with soldierly exactness. Over the meal, the conversation returned to the past, and though the tone was warm, Poirot could sense the strain. Margaret made an elegant remark about how time smooths the rough edges of memory, to which Dr. Cross replied with an odd intensity, or sharpens them, depending on the conscience. Edward Vale laughed it off, raising his glass. Here's to old sins forgotten. But Clara Finch paled visibly, her fork trembling in her hand. Poirot noted it all, saying nothing. Later, as they retired once more to the drawing-room, Poirot reflected. Here were 5 individuals bound by long acquaintance, yet not wholly at ease. Beneath their polished exchanges, he detected secrets, threads of unease, glances swiftly exchanged, silences swiftly filled. He smoothed his moustache thoughtfully. Yes, he murmured to himself, this gathering, it has a significance. And Hercule Poirot must discover it. For where secrets are hidden, mon ami, there often follows the crime. And with that, the little detective settled himself by the fire, content to wait, to observe, to allow the human drama to unfold before his watchful eyes. Chapter 2, Shadows of the Past. The following morning dawned pale and thin, with a mist that clung stubbornly to the lawns of Waverly Grange. Hercule Poirot, who had risen earlier than his hosts, stood at the long windows of his guest chamber and observed the world outside with fastidious disapproval. Dew soaked the grass, and the hedgerows drooped heavily, as though weighed down by some private sorrow. Bah, he muttered. This English damp, it is the enemy of the Constitution. It creeps into the bones, it wilts the moustache, it clouds the spirits. Yet, his eyes narrowed slightly. Yet it is fitting, perhaps, for a house where secrets breathe beneath the laughter. He had thought long the night before of the subtle currents beneath the surface of the reunion. His little grey cells had been stirred not by what was said, but by what was not. A silence here, an exchange of glances there, the tremor of a hand reaching too swiftly for a glass. To the ordinary observer it would have seemed no more than fatigue or memory playing tricks. But Poirot knew better. Human nature was his constant study, and here was a gathering ripe with unspoken history. Breakfast was served in the sunroom, a chamber lined with glass that tried valiantly to admit cheer into the dreary morning. Colonel Lytton sat at the head of the table, sturdy in posture though shadows lay beneath his eyes. He greeted Poirot with a hearty "Good morning, sir," but his smile did not reach far. Margaret Denham entered next, graceful in a pale gown, and took her seat with a smile that appeared genuine, though Poirot detected something guarded about the way she avoided the Colonel's gaze. Dr. Henry Cross followed, carrying under his arm a slim medical journal. He nodded curtly to the company, murmured a brief morning, and set about buttering toast with precise economy of movement. Edward Vale bounded in last, rubbing his hands. "Ah! A day for duck shooting, what? Nothing like the mist to bring them low. We must organize an outing." His joviality rang out, but Poirot noticed again how quick his eyes darted to each face in turn, as though searching for confirmation, or perhaps reassurance. Clara Finch slipped in quietly, taking her place almost apologetically. She spilt a spoonful of marmalade in her nervous haste, and her cheeks flashed scarlet. No one remarked upon it, but Poirot observed how her lips pressed tightly together afterwards, as if sealing words unspoken. Breakfast conversation meandered easily at first: the price of grain, the unreliability of trains, the weather, always the weather. Poirot listened politely, contributing little. He was content to study. It was Margaret Denham who introduced a note of the past. "Do you recall, Arthur," she asked lightly, "those evenings at Cambridge when you insisted upon chairing our little debates? You were a tyrant with the gavel, I remember." The Colonel chuckled, though somewhat stiffly. "A tyrant? I call it discipline, my dear. A gathering without order descends into chaos." Edward Vale slapped the table, laughing loudly. "Indeed. He silenced me on more than one occasion, though never for long. I always did enjoy having the last word." Dr. Cross looked up from his paper. "Too often, if memory serves." His voice was even, but there was a sharp edge beneath it. Clara Finch gave a quick, nervous laugh, then fell silent again, staring down into her tea. Poirot, his fingers steepled delicately, leaned forward. "It was, then, a society? A debating club, perhaps?" "Yes," said Margaret, a shade too quickly. "A little circle of friends who fancied themselves philosophers. Nothing more." But Poirot caught the Colonel's glance at her, sharp, almost warning. "Bah," Vale said, waving his hand. "We made more mischief than philosophy, I assure you, M. Poirot. Nothing but youthful folly." Dr. Cross folded his paper. Youthful follies, however, sometimes have consequences that echo beyond the years. Silence followed the remark, broken only by the faint clink of cutlery. Poirot noted with interest how each avoided the other's eye. Later, as they strolled in the garden, Poirot fell into step beside Colonel Lytton. "Mon Colonel," he said gently, "forgive my curiosity, but I perceive that you have gathered your friends not merely for nostalgia. There is, how shall I put it, one tension." The Colonel's moustache bristled. "You are perceptive, sir." He paused, glancing about as though to ensure privacy. "These are old friends, too old, perhaps, for the truth to remain buried forever. It weighs upon me, M. Poirot." "It weighs heavily." Poirot inclined his head. "Then perhaps you seek to unburden yourself." But the Colonel shook his head. "Not yet. Soon, perhaps. When the time is right." He broke off abruptly, clearing his throat. "Forgive me. I am a foolish old man. Come, let us rejoin the others." Yet Poirot, with his sharp eye, noticed again the Colonel's hand slide into his pocket, where the folded letter lay concealed. The faintest crumple of paper betrayed the gesture. The day wore on. Edward Vale organized a card game, where he laughed too loudly at his own misfortunes. Margaret Denham walked with Clara in the garden, their heads close together, though Clara's expression remained troubled. Dr. Cross retired to the library, claiming professional reading to occupy him, though Poirot suspected it was more to avoid the company. Throughout, the Colonel maintained his cheer, but it was brittle, forced. His eyes grew distant at intervals, his jaw tightening with unspoken thoughts. That evening, after dinner, when the others gathered around the fire once more, Poirot observed something most telling. The Colonel rose to fetch a book from the shelf, but as he did so, the letter slipped from his pocket. He caught it swiftly, thrusting it back with a muttered exclamation. Yet in that instant Poirot's keen gaze had registered more, a single line visible upon the page. The truth of that night must be told. Poirot's moustaches stiffened. Ah, he whispered to himself, so it is a truth that binds them, a truth of long ago. And our host, he wrestles with whether to speak or remain silent. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the fire's warmth wash over him, and smiled faintly. Bon. The drama begins. Chapter 3, The Sudden Silence. The rain had returned by evening, drumming steadily against the tall windows of Waverly Grange. Thunder muttered in the distance, and the lamps burned low, their glow turning the library into a pool of golden warmth against the storm outside. Colonel Lytton had declared the night one for reflection rather than games, and so the company gathered in the library after supper. Books lined the walls in solemn rows, and the fire crackled cheerfully in the grate, though it could not quite dispel the tension that clung to the room like the damp mist outside. Edward Vale lounged in a leather armchair, glass of brandy in hand, recounting a mildly scandalous tale from his days at the bar. Margaret Denham sat with her embroidery, listening but offering only occasional remarks, her needle flashing in and out of the cloth like a subtle punctuation. Dr. Cross, hunched by the desk, leafed through a heavy medical volume with such intensity that one might think he wished to escape into its pages. Clara Finch perched near the fire, her hands tightly clasped, her gaze fixed upon the flames. And the Colonel himself? He sat a little apart, in his favourite chair by the mantelpiece, pipe in hand, his features grave despite the attempt at joviality. From time to time his fingers strayed unconsciously to his pocket, where Poirot knew the letter rested still. Poirot, seated unobtrusively at the edge of the circle, watched it all with a cat-like patience. The little grey cells were at work. Something would happen, he felt it, as surely as one feels the storm before it breaks. It was shortly before 10 when the gathering began to scatter. Clara, pale with fatigue, excused herself and retired early. Margaret followed not long after, claiming a headache. Dr. Cross shut his book with a snap and declared he had professional papers to review upstairs. Edward Vale, still lively, insisted on one last glass before bed, and drifted toward the sideboard. Poirot lingered by the fire. The Colonel stood, stretching his shoulders, and gave a half-smile. "Stay a moment, Poirot. I should like a quiet word with you before the night ends." Poirot inclined his head. "But certainly, Colonel. I am at your service." Yet as Vale rejoined them with his brandy, the Colonel waved him cheerfully toward the drawing-room. "Off you go, Edward. I will join you presently." Vale shrugged, bade them good night, and disappeared, humming under his breath. Poirot rose. "Shall I leave you also, mon Colonel?" But the Colonel shook his head. "No, stay. Only, give me a few minutes. There is something I must consider before I speak." He sank back into his chair, pipe between his teeth, eyes staring into the flames. "Yes, a few minutes more." Poirot bowed slightly. "As you wish. I will retire." Vaughan knew it, Colonel. He left the library, but his mind remained alert, tuned to the Colonel's unease. It was not yet the moment for revelation, but it was close. The night deepened. The storm rolled nearer, lightning flickering faintly against the curtained windows. Poirot lay in his room, wakeful, the puzzle turning in his mind. Who had written the letter? What was the truth of that night that so haunted the Colonel? And why, above all, did the atmosphere among the friends resemble a stage prepared for tragedy? He dozed lightly until a sudden sound brought him fully awake, a cry, muffled and brief, followed by hurried footsteps in the corridor. Poirot rose at once, dressing gown about his shoulders, and stepped out. The maid, white-faced, was running toward the guest rooms. "Sir! Sir! It's the Colonel!" Poirot did not wait for more. He hastened down the stairs, his small figure swift and precise. The library door stood ajar. He pushed it open. The fire had burned low, casting shadows across the room. The storm outside gave a distant growl. And in his chair by the mantelpiece, Colonel Arthur Lytton sat motionless, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his eyes fixed and glassy. Poirot advanced swiftly. The glass at the Colonel's elbow was nearly empty, but the air around it carried a faint, unmistakable odor. Bitter almonds. Poirot's moustaches twitched grimly. Ah! Cyanide. He bent closer, examining with delicate precision. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no mark upon the body. Death had come swiftly, silently, while the storm raged outside and the house slept. Poirot straightened, his expression grave. So it begins. Within minutes, the household was roused. Margaret Denham appeared, shawl about her shoulders, her face pale but composed. Dr. Cross, summoned from his room, entered with a physician's briskness, only to falter when he saw the truth already plain. Edward Vale burst in last, protesting loudly, his voice edged with disbelief. Clara Finch came trembling, clinging to Margaret's arm, her eyes wide with horror. Poirot raised his hand for silence. "Messrs, Mesdames, be calm. The Colonel is dead. Murdered." Gasps filled the room. Edward Vale swore softly. Clara gave a little cry. Margaret pressed her lips together, her hands tightening on Clara's arm. Dr. Cross, recovering himself, muttered, "Poison." "Yes. That odor, it can be nothing else." Poirot nodded gravely. "Exactly so, Doctor. Poison placed in his drink. It was deliberate, calculated. And the poisoner, he or she is among us." They stared at him, aghast. "Among us," whispered Clara. "Mais oui," Poirot said softly. "No stranger has entered this house tonight. The storm made sure of that. No servant has been in this room since supper. Therefore the truth is plain, one of you, his old friends, has placed the poison in the Colonel's glass." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. Edward Vale recovered first, speaking loudly, almost defiantly. "Then let the police come. Let them question us all. They'll find no guilt here." Yet his fingers trembled as he set down his brandy glass. Margaret Denham spoke quietly, almost too quietly. "A dreadful end, but surely not one of us." Clara whispered, "It cannot be, it cannot," and buried her face in her hands. Dr. Cross alone met Poirot's gaze steadily. "We must act at once. Secure the scene, summon the authorities, and allow proper procedure. Anything less is chaos." Poirot inclined his head. "You are correct, Doctor. But until they arrive, I will make my own observations. Already I see certain things, very certain things." He looked slowly about the room, his eyes resting on each in turn. The glass upon the table, it was not poured by the Colonel himself. The level of the bottle and the trace of liquid remaining tell me this. Someone prepared it for him. Someone placed it at his elbow. And that someone is here. He paused, letting the words sink in. "Messrs, Mesdames, I beg you, remain calm. Hercule Poirot will discover the truth. It always reveals itself to those who seek with method and patience. And I promise you this, before long, I shall know which of you has exchanged friendship for betrayal, and memory for murder. His voice was quiet, but in the silence that followed, it carried the weight of inevitability. Outside, the storm broke in earnest, rain lashing the windows. And within Waverly Grange, the first threads of a deadly puzzle began to unravel beneath Poirot's keen gaze. Chapter 4: Alibis and Denials. The storm had spent itself by morning, leaving behind a washed grey sky and a world heavy with silence. Waverly Grange, usually so solid and secure, seemed now a place besieged, not by weather, but by fear. Poirot descended to the dining room after a restless night. The others were already gathered there, pale and subdued. Margaret Denham sat straight-backed, her breakfast untouched. Clara Finch stirred her tea endlessly, as though hypnotized by the circles it traced. Edward Vale tried for a bluff cheer, speaking loudly of beastly bad luck, though his laugh rang hollow. Dr. Cross, neat as ever, buttered his toast with the precision of a surgeon, yet his eyes were dark and watchful. Poirot waited until the maid withdrew, then cleared his throat. "Miss Amiss, I regret the intrusion of duty upon your grief. But time, she is precious. If the truth is to be found, it must be sought at once. Each of you must tell me where you were when last you saw the Colonel alive." The silence that followed was thick with apprehension. Margaret Denham spoke first, her voice composed though faintly brittle. "I left the library at 9:30. I had a headache and retired to my room. I remained there until I was woken by the commotion." Poirot inclined his head. "And you saw no one in the corridors?" "No. I went directly upstairs." He noted how her fingers toyed with her handkerchief, twisting it into a narrow rope. Next was Dr. Cross. "I too left before 10. I took a medical journal to my room. I read for an hour at least, until fatigue overcame me." Poirot studied him. "And you heard nothing?" "Not the cry that roused the maid." Cross shook his head. "Nothing until the maid's alarm." His voice was calm, but his gaze was fixed, almost too steady. Edward Vale gave a jovial shrug. "I stayed up later, as you know, Poirot. I poured myself a last brandy after the Colonel said he'd join me presently. But he never came. After a few minutes, I retired also. My room's at the far end of the corridor. I was nearly asleep when all the shouting began." Poirot raised a delicate eyebrow. "You say you poured yourself a brandy. Was it from the same decanter as the Colonel's?" Vale blinked, then forced a laugh. "Why yes, naturally. I helped myself from the sideboard. But you don't imagine I tampered with his glass?" "Ridiculous." Poirot spread his hands. "I imagine nothing. I only observe." Clara Finch spoke last. She clasped her hand so tightly the knuckles whitened. I was restless. I went for a walk in the gardens, though the weather was damp. I thought the air might steady my nerves. Afterwards, I returned to my room. I saw no one." Poirot leaned forward gently. "But, madam, the storm, was it not unpleasant?" She faltered. Yes, it was. But I preferred it to lying awake." Her eyes darted toward Margaret, as though seeking reassurance, before dropping once more to her cup. Poirot considered them all in silence for a moment, his fingers steepled. "Each of you," he said softly, "was alone. Each presents an alibi that no one can confirm. This, it is most convenient, for the murderer." The words fell into the room like stones into water. Clara gasped. Margaret's lips tightened. Edward Vale blustered. "Come now, you can't mean, surely you don't suspect." "I suspect everyone," Poirot interrupted firmly. "Until the truth is clear, I trust no one. Even the smallest inconsistency may reveal much." He rose and motioned them toward the library. The Colonel's body had been removed, yet the room retained the faint odor of almonds. The glass still rested upon the side table, a silent witness. Poirot picked it up delicately with a handkerchief. Observe. There are 4 glasses upon the sideboard. 3 hold only the trace of brandy, no more. But this 1 inch he lifted the Colonel's smells unmistakably of poison. The question is, who poured it? He glanced around. The Colonel was in the room alone for some time after we left. Did any of you return? There was a murmur of denial. Yet one of you must have done so, Poirot said quietly. For the glass did not walk to his hand unaided. Margaret spoke with sudden sharpness. Are you suggesting that one of us crept back like a thief in the night? It is absurd. Poirot turned his gaze upon her. It is murder, madam. Murder is always absurd, yet it exists. Dr. Cross adjusted his spectacles. Surely the servants could have tampered with it. Poirot shook his head. The servants had no reason to enter the library after supper. I questioned them this morning. None approached this room. No, this act belongs to one of the Colonel's guests. Clara Finch let out a stifled sob. Edward Vail muttered angrily under his breath. Poirot continued, his tone precise. The Colonel believed himself on the brink of revealing a truth. I saw the letter he carried, partly burned, but enough remained. Someone here feared that truth. Someone chose to silence him before it could be spoken. The room fell silent. Rain dripped steadily from the eaves outside, the only sound in the oppressive hush. Poirot moved slowly about the room, examining small details. A faint ring upon the side table suggested that the Colonel's glass had been moved, replaced. A scatter of ash on the hearth indicated that papers had been burned recently, hurriedly. He turned back to the others. Each of you claims to have been elsewhere. Yet one of you lies. Which? Edward Vail's laugh was brittle. If you think me capable of slipping poison into a comrade's glass, you misjudge me, sir. I drank from the same decanter myself. Would I risk my own life? Perhaps, Poirot murmured, you prepared the Colonel's glass separately, taking care your own was untouched. Margaret interjected sharply. This line of questioning helps nothing. It serves only to sow distrust. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Exactly so, madam. Distrust is the seed of truth. For when it grows, it reveals the guilty among the innocent. At last he gestured toward the door. Enough for now. I thank you for your cooperation. I must think most carefully. For the puzzle is delicate, and already the picture begins to form. As the guests filed out, Poirot lingered alone in the library. He lifted the poisoned glass once more, holding it to the light. Yes, he whispered, the hand that poured this drink also trembled when I spoke of the letter. A psychology most revealing. His eyes narrowed, his moustaches twitching. The little grey cell stirred with life. The web was tightening. The truth, still hidden, waited to be drawn into the open. Chapter 5, The Letter in the Fire. The morning wore on with a heaviness that pressed upon Waverly Grange like a shroud. The police had been notified, of course, but rural Sussex was not swift in its responses, and it would be several hours before the inspector arrived. In that interim, Hercule Poirot considered it his duty, as well as his pleasure, to let the little grey cells go to work. The guests were unsettled, restless. Margaret Denham retreated to the morning room, apparently to write letters, though Poirot suspected little ink reached the page. Edward Vail smoked incessantly in the drawing-room, pacing like a caged animal. Dr. Cross shut himself up with a medical volume, as though anatomy could shield him from suspicion. Clara Finch drifted between rooms, wringing her hands, her face pale and pinched. Poirot, discreetly unobtrusive, wandered the house. It was not in his nature to idle while mystery lingered. The library drew him back, as surely as a lodestone draws iron. Here, in this quiet, wood-panelled chamber, the Colonel had faced his fate. Here, too, must lie the first threads of the truth. Poirot examined the room with a meticulous eye. The decanter still stood upon the sideboard, now sealed by the butler. The glasses had been removed for analysis. The armchair, vacant and solemn, bore the faint impression of the Colonel's form. But it was the hearth that held Poirot's attention. A small fire lingered, reduced now to ashes and grey cinders. He bent low, his eyes narrowing. Among the fragments of charred paper, faint markings remained. With great care, he extracted them using the fire tongs, placing them delicately upon a clean sheet of paper. The pieces were fragile, brittle to the touch, but Poirot's patience was infinite. Slowly, painstakingly, he assembled them like a puzzle. A word here, a half-sentence there. Enough to form a glimpse of what had been destroyed. At last, he murmured aloud. "Cannot remain silent any longer. The truth of that night must be told." Poirot sat back, his moustaches bristling. Voila! It is as I suspected. The Colonel intended a revelation. And one among his friends, he feared it. He tapped the fragments gently with one finger. But what was this tonight? And why should the truth, after so many years, be worth a man's life? Ah, les secrets, they are the poison more deadly than any cyanide. Poirot gathered the group together later that afternoon in the drawing-room. The storm had cleared, but the atmosphere within the house was heavier still. "Mesdames, messieurs," Poirot began, "I have made a discovery. In the fireplace of the library, I found remains of a letter. The Colonel had burned it, or attempted to. But enough survived." He held up the fragments. "It speaks of a truth hidden, the truth of that night." "What night, I ask you? What truth?" The effect was immediate. Margaret Denham's hand tightened upon her chair arm. Clara Finch uttered a small cry. Edward Vale shifted uneasily, while Dr. Cross merely pursed his lips. "None of us knows what that means," Margaret said firmly, though her voice trembled. Surely it was the Colonel's private matter. Poirot inclined his head. A matter private, perhaps. But fatal, certainly. Edward Vale laughed, but without conviction. "This is melodrama, Poirot. You spin mysteries from ashes. We all know the Colonel was a man of sentimental impulses. Perhaps he wrote of some trivial indiscretion long past. Nothing more." "Trivial?" Poirot's eyes glinted. "Then why is he dead?" Vale's laugh died in his throat. Poirot leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Messieurs, mesdames, you are 5 old friends bound by memory. Something happened in your past, an event that has cast its shadow even to this day. Colonel Lytton meant to speak of it. Someone here did not wish him to do so. Therefore, he is dead." Clara Finch burst into tears. "No, no, it's not true. None of us would, none of us could." Poirot's tone softened. "Madam, you are frightened, yes. But remember, to deny is not enough. The truth, she is patient. She will not remain hidden." Dr. Cross spoke with measured calm. "I refuse to be a party to this performance. You accuse us without evidence. A burned letter proves nothing." "Au contraire, Doctor," Poirot said smoothly. "It proves everything. The Colonel burned it, yes, but why? Not to conceal it from strangers, for there are none here. He burned it because he feared someone among you. Yet he kept it still upon his person, unable to destroy it entirely. That is a conflict most human." His eyes rested briefly on each face, watching, weighing. Margaret avoided his gaze. Clara stared at the floor. Vale fidgeted with his watch chain. Dr. Cross remained rigid, his expression unreadable. Poirot smiled faintly. Already, I begin to see the outline of events. It is like a portrait, at first blurred, but soon, it will sharpen. After the meeting, Poirot strolled into the hall where Edward Vale lingered, attempting to light a cigar. The match trembled slightly in Vale's hand. "You seem uneasy, monsieur," Poirot remarked. "Nonsense," Vale retorted, his tone sharp. "This is a beastly business, but it has nothing to do with me." Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Yet the maid tells me she saw you near the library close to midnight." "A small stroll, perhaps." Vale stiffened. "What of it?" "I went to fetch a glass of water." "Is that a crime now?" Poirot's voice was soft, almost sympathetic. "Non, monsieur. But it is curious that you neglected to mention it when giving your account." Vale's colour rose. "I forgot. That's all." Forgotten in the shock of the moment. Poirot bowed slightly. "Perhaps. Yet the memory, she is most selective. One forgets what is inconvenient, no." He left Vale sputtering, retreating upstairs. In the evening, Poirot walked the garden paths with Margaret Denham. She kept her composure, but Poirot noted how tightly she clutched her shawl against her shoulders. "Madam," Poirot said gently, "you are a woman of intelligence. You know more than you admit." Her eyes flashed. "If I do, monsieur, it is my affair." Poirot's moustaches twitched. "But murder, madam, is never a private affair. It spreads. It touches all." For a moment she faltered, then drew herself up. "You speak cleverly, M. Poirot. But cleverness does not always reveal truth." Poirot smiled. "Ah, but sometimes, it does." That night, as the house sank into uneasy silence, Poirot sat alone in his room, the fragments of the burned letter before him. He studied them once more, his mind weaving threads of memory and motive. "The truth of that night," he murmured. "What night, mon Dieu? And why, after all these years, must it emerge now?" He tapped his temple lightly. "Patience, Hercule. Patience. The murderer is clever, yes. But already they betray themselves. With the psychology, always, it escapes." He extinguished his lamp, the faintest smile playing at his lips. "Soon, very soon, I shall know." Chapter 6, Fractures Among Friends. The inspector from Lewis had at last arrived, a practical man with muddy boots and little patience for delicate psychology. He tramped through Waverly Grange, taking statements and measuring glasses, yet Poirot observed him with polite detachment. Such men, he reflected, were useful for facts but blind to subtleties. The little grey cells required more nourishment than measurements could provide. By afternoon, the inspector had gone to confer with his constables, leaving Poirot once more in command of the atmosphere. He chose his moment carefully, calling the 5 friends once more to the drawing-room. They gathered reluctantly. Edward Vale was flushed with irritation, Margaret Denham stiff with dignity, Clara Finch trembled visibly, Dr. Cross remained inscrutable, only Poirot's calm elegance seemed unaltered. "My friends," Poirot began, "forgive me if I trouble you yet again. But murder is a weed, it spreads unless rooted out. And already I see how it grows between you, driving wedges into friendships of many years. Let us talk openly. Let us bring into the light that which festers in the dark." Edward Vale gave a bark of laughter. "What are we, schoolchildren waiting for a scolding? You prod and pry, Poirot, but you've no proof against any of us. Perhaps you ought to turn your suspicions upon the servants instead." Margaret shot him a cold look. "Do not be absurd, Edward. You know very well this was not the work of a maid." "Do I?" he snapped. And what do you know, Margaret? You speak as though you're quite certain where guilt lies. Her lips thinned. At least I do not make a spectacle of myself, blustering and shouting like a guilty man. Vale rose from his chair, fists clenching. Poirot raised a hand delicately. Calm yourselves, messrs, mesdames. To quarrel, it achieves nothing. But his gaze sharpened, it is most revealing. Clara Finch's thin voice broke in. Can we not stop this? It's dreadful, all of it. We've lost Geoffrey, and now we sit tearing each other apart. He would hate it, hate it. Poirot turned gently toward her. Madam, grief makes you tremble. Yet it is not only grief, n'est-ce pas? You fear something. Something more than death itself. She buried her face in her hands. I don't know what you mean. Perhaps, Poirot said softly. But your eyes betray you, madam. They look always at Margaret, as though asking permission to speak, or fearing her disapproval. That, it is curious. Margaret's eyes flashed. Poirot, I will not have Clara bullied. She has endured much already. Poirot inclined his head. Then perhaps you will explain why she looks to you so. A silence followed, heavy with unspoken words. Clara lifted her head, her cheeks wet. Because Margaret knows what happened. She has always known. The words fell into the room like thunder. Margaret rose at once, her composure cracking. Clara! Be silent. But Poirot's voice was velvet and steel. No, madam. Let her speak. Already I sense that we approach the heart of the matter. Clara's hands twisted together. It was years ago, that night. Geoffrey said he would never speak of it, but I knew he meant to. I saw it in his eyes. And Margaret begged him not to. She feared what it would mean. Edward Vale swore under his breath. Dr. Cross adjusted his spectacles, his face still unreadable. Poirot's gaze rested on Margaret. Is this true, madam? Did you plead with the Colonel for silence? Margaret's chin lifted. If I did, it was only because I feared scandal, pointless scandal that would destroy reputations for no gain. But to suggest that I... Her voice broke. She pressed her lips together, regaining control. Poirot studied her for a long moment, then turned to Edward Vale. And you, monsieur? You grow angry, yes, but anger often hides fear. What did you dread that night might reveal? Vale slammed his fist upon the table. Nothing. Nothing. Do you hear? Geoffrey was a fool to rake up old ashes. The past is dead, better left buried. Ah, Poirot murmured, but the past, it does not bury itself. It returns, like a letter half burned. For the first time, Dr. Cross spoke with force. This is nonsense. We are allowing ourselves to be manipulated. Lytton is dead. Nothing will bring him back. To rake over ancient history will not help. On the contrary, Poirot said quietly. It will help most of all. For only when we know what happened that night shall we know why one of you killed to keep it hidden. Clara gave a little sob. Stop, please stop. I cannot bear it. Poirot's eyes softened, but his tone remained steady. Courage, madam. The truth, she demands courage. Without it, more suffering will follow. The quarrel simmered on. Vale muttered furiously, pacing the room. Margaret stood rigid, her hands gripping the back of a chair. Clara sat weeping softly. Dr. Cross observed in silence, but a muscle twitched at his jawline. Poirot allowed the silence to deepen, then spoke once more. Consider, Miss Amiss, the Colonel feared enough to write his letter, yet not enough to destroy it utterly. He believed the truth must come. And you or his friends are bound together by that secret. One of you found the courage to silence him. Or perhaps, was it desperation? He let the question linger. Margaret spoke suddenly, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. You are cruel, M. Poirot. You force us to revisit what should never have been revisited. Poirot bowed his head. Perhaps. But cruelty in the service of justice is not cruelty, madam, it is duty. If you do not tell me the truth, it will emerge nonetheless. Better it comes with dignity than with disgrace. Her eyes glittered, but she said no more. When at last the gathering dispersed, the atmosphere was poisoned with suspicion. Edward Vale stalked out muttering darkly. Clara fled upstairs in tears. Margaret followed, silent and pale. Dr. Cross remained a moment, regarding Poirot with cool disdain. You play dangerous games, M. Poirot, he said. Poirot met his gaze evenly. It is not a game, Doctor. It is murder. Cross gave a curt nod and departed. Left alone, Poirot strolled slowly to the window. Outside, the lawns gleamed wet from the storm, the sky washed pale. He clasped his hands behind his back. Yes, he murmured. The psychology, it works. Already they crack, like porcelain beneath the hammer. Soon, the whole picture will be visible. His moustaches twitched upward in a faint smile. The murderer trembles. And when the murderer trembles, Poirot triumphs. Chapter 7, Poirot sets the trap. The next day dawned bright but brittle, the kind of morning where sunlight sharpens rather than warms. Waverly Grange, for all its grandeur, seemed now a prison, its corridors echoing with silence, its drawing rooms thick with unease. Poirot, immaculate in his grey suit and patent leather shoes, appeared at breakfast with an air of cheer entirely at odds with the others. Clara Finch barely touched her toast, Margaret Denham read her newspaper without turning a page, Edward Vale drained his coffee as if it were brandy, Dr. Cross dissected a boiled egg with surgical severity. My friends, Poirot announced lightly, I have decided that this evening we shall conduct a small experiment. A reconstruction, as it were. It will amuse me, and perhaps enlighten us all. For pairs of wary eyes looked up. Reconstruction? Vale demanded. What in blazes do you mean? Poirot's moustaches twitched. Simply this, we shall recreate the final hours of Colonel Lytton. Each of you shall sit as you did in the library. We shall drink a toast, only water, I assure you, and we shall see what little grey cells may stir. Margaret's lips compressed into a line. This is distasteful, M. Poirot. To treat Geoffrey's death as some parlour trick. Poirot raised a hand. None, madam. It is not trickery, but truth. If the murderer is among us, and he is, then the walls of silence will break tonight. The silence that followed was taut as wire. At last Dr. Cross said evenly, very well. If it will quiet this business, I agree. One by one, the others muttered assent, though unease hung thick in the air. Poirot smiled serenely. Bon. Tonight, then. All day, Poirot moved unobtrusively about the house, yet always with purpose. He spoke briefly with the butler, instructing him on certain preparations. He inspected the library with fastidious attention, arranging chairs precisely where they had stood that fateful night. He asked that fresh glasses be set upon the sideboard, filled only with water. But it was the small, unnoticed things that mattered most. A word dropped here, a question asked there, each designed to unbalance, to unsettle. Poirot, master of psychology, sowed unease like a gardener scattering seed. By evening, the household was frayed and taut, the storm inside sharper than any that had rattled the windows days before. At precisely 9 o'clock, Poirot gathered them in the library. The fire burned low, casting long shadows. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees. "Miss Amiss," Poirot said softly, "you will indulge me. Sit as you sat before. Let us recall the night." Reluctantly, they obeyed. Margaret took the chair by the window, Clara near the fire, Vale sprawled heavily at the side table, Dr. Cross upright in his armchair. Poirot himself stood, immaculate and composed, surveying them like a conductor before an orchestra. He lifted a glass of water. "We shall drink, as you drank with the Colonel." "To friendship?" They raised their glasses, some with trembling hands. The clink of glass echoed strangely in the room. Poirot sipped, then set his glass down. His eyes, keen and bright, moved from face to face. "Now," he said softly, "we wait." As the Colonel waited, his glass before him. He was uneasy, I think. He carried a letter, half-burned. A confession of sorts. He feared it, yet he could not wholly destroy it. He meant to reveal the truth of that night. Clara gasped faintly. Margaret's gaze turned to stone. Vale shifted in his seat, muttering. Cross remained impassive, though his jaw tightened. Poirot's voice was calm, hypnotic. "One of you, knowing what he intended, slipped back into this room. You poured into his glass the poison, bitter with almonds. He raised it to his lips, never suspecting betrayal from a friend. And thus he died." The silence was suffocating. Clara trembled, whispering, "Please, must we?" "Yes, madam," Poirot said firmly. "For the murderer is here. Even now." And the murderer trembles. Suddenly Edward Vale surged to his feet, his face flushed. "I'll not sit here and be accused. I had no hand in Geoffrey's death. Yes, I was near the library, but only for water. If that makes me a suspect, so be it, but I won't stand for this charade." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, monsieur, but you do stand, for too long. Sit, if you please. Your anger betrays you. Yet perhaps not guilt, perhaps only fear." Vale glared, but after a moment he sank back into his chair, breathing hard. Poirot turned his gaze upon Margaret. "And you, madam? You spoke often of silence. You feared scandal. You sought to prevent the Colonel from speaking. Would you kill to keep the past buried?" Margaret's voice rang clear. "I would not. I argued, yes. I begged him to forget. But murder? Never." Poirot inclined his head slightly, but his eyes did not leave hers. "And you, Dr. Cross? You were calm, precise. A man of science. To mix a draught, to measure poison, it would be easy for you. Too easy." Cross met his gaze without flinching. "To suggest I would betray a friend under my roof is absurd. Your theatrics grow tiresome, M. Poirot." "Perhaps," Poirot murmured. "But even theatrics reveal truth. The guilty, they cannot endure the play." Poirot let the silence draw out, longer and longer, until it seemed unbearable. The only sound was the crackle of the fire, the ticking of the mantel clock. Then he spoke, softly, with sudden intensity. "The truth of that night. You know of which night I speak. Years ago, something happened, something terrible. Colonel Lytton meant to confess it. He believed the burden too heavy to bear. One of you feared exposure more than friendship, more than life itself. One of you poisoned him." His words hung in the air like smoke. Clara Finch broke first. She leapt to her feet, her face pale, her hands trembling. "Stop it! Please, for pity's sake, stop. You don't understand, you can't understand." Poirot's gaze fixed upon her. "But I do, madam. I understand more than you think. you tremble now as you trembled that night. The psychology, it is most revealing. She sank back into her chair, weeping silently. Margaret placed a hand upon her shoulder, though her own face was drawn with strain. Poirot looked once more around the room, his eyes glittering. Tonight, the trap is set. I have seen enough. The little grey cells are satisfied. Tomorrow, Miss Amiss, we shall meet again. And then, before you all, I shall speak the name of the murderer. His words fell into the silence like a gavel striking. No one spoke. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. Outside, the wind sighed. Poirot, serene and unhurried, smoothed his moustache. Bourne knew it, Miss Amiss. Sleep well, if you can. He left them there, in the library heavy with shadows, each staring into the flames as though the truth itself might emerge from the fire. Chapter 8. The Truth of That Night. The following evening, at precisely 8 o'clock, Hercule Poirot summoned the household once more to the library. The air was thick with tension, none had slept well. Shadows stretched long across the polished floor, and the fire burned low, its glow a reminder of the night that had shattered them. Margaret Denham entered first, her posture rigid, her lips pressed thin. Edward Vale came in with bluster, yet his eyes darted nervously. Clara Finch followed timidly, clutching a handkerchief, her steps hesitant. Dr. Cross arrived last, grave and silent, his expression unreadable. Poirot stood at the hearth, immaculate as ever, his hands resting lightly upon the back of a chair. His eye swept over them, calm yet penetrating. Miss Amiss, he began softly, at last, the moment has come. You wish to know who killed Colonel Lytton. I shall tell you. But first, we must speak of that night. For until its truth is known, the motive for murder cannot be understood. A murmur ran through the group. Margaret's eyes flashed. Vale muttered something under his breath. Clara let out a faint cry. Poirot raised a hand. Patience, if you please. Years ago, there was an outing, was there not? A night when 5 friends, carefree and young, found themselves caught in circumstances most unfortunate. His eyes fixed on Clara. Madam Finch, you remember. Even now, you tremble. Clara's hands twisted in her lap. I cannot. But you must, Poirot said gently. For if you do not speak, I shall. That night, there was an accident. A man died. Do I speak the truth? Clara buried her face in her hands. Yes, she whispered. Yes, it's true. A collective shudder ran through the room. Poirot continued, his voice quiet but relentless. A man, an innocent man, was struck down by the motor car in which you travelled. It was dark, the road narrow. Panic seized you. The driver wished to go for help, but the others, they persuaded him otherwise. There was fear of scandal, of ruin. And so the body was left, the death concealed. Edward Vale sprang up, his face crimson. It was an accident. Nothing could be done. You've no right to. Poirot silenced him with a look. I have every right, monsieur. For it is this secret that poisoned your friendships and led, in the end, to murder. He turned to Margaret. It was you who urged silence, was it not? The Colonel wished to confess even then. But you forbade it. Your name, your family's reputation, those were at stake. Margaret's lips trembled. I feared disgrace. We were young. Foolish. I thought the past would fade if left buried. Poirot inclined his head. But the past, madam, she does not bury herself. The Colonel never forgot. His conscience tormented him. He resolved to confess at last. He wrote his letter, and he spoke his intent aloud. That is why he died. Poirot's eyes swept over them, sharp as blades. One among you, terrified of exposure, slipped back to the library. Into the Colonel's glass was poured cyanide, swift, merciless. He drank, believing himself among friends. And so, he died at the hands of one he trusted. The room was silent but for the crackling of the fire. Then Poirot straightened, his voice firm. The murderer is you, Dr. Cross. All eyes turned to the doctor. For a moment he sat immobile, his face carved from stone. Then a faint smile twisted his lips. You are very clever, M. Poirot, he said softly. But tell me, how do you prove it? Poirot spread his hands. With psychology, with reason, with observation. Consider, the poison was administered with precision. Who among you had both the knowledge and the nerve? A doctor, accustomed to life and death, to exact measurements. You, Dr. Cross. Further, when first we spoke of the poisoned glass, you alone did not recoil. You said only that you had been reading in your room. Yet the maid did not see you there. She saw your door ajar, the room dark. And more, when I staged our little reconstruction, you remained calm, too calm. Anger betrayed Vale, fear betrayed Clara, stubborn pride betrayed Margaret. But your composure was unnatural. Only one who has already crossed the line into murder could sit so still while I described it. Poirot's moustaches quivered. Enfin, there is the letter. The Colonel's words, the truth of that night must be told. For Vale, for Margaret, even for Clara, exposure would mean shame, yes, but not destruction. For you, Doctor, it would mean ruin. For it was you who drove the car. You who struck the man. You who begged them to leave the scene. To be exposed now would end your career, your honor, everything. So you silenced the one man who refused to be silent. Clara let out a cry. Oh, God, it's true. It was he who drove. He swore us all to secrecy. Margaret bowed her head, as though the weight of years had at last crushed her. Vale swore violently, then fell silent, his fists clenched. Dr. Cross rose slowly, his expression grim yet strangely relieved. Yes, he said. I drove. And Geoffrey, damn him, could never leave it alone. I begged him. But he would not listen. He was going to the police, even after all these years. What would you have had me do? Stand by while my life was destroyed? Poirot's eyes were cold. I would have had you bear the consequences of your past. That is honor. To kill, monsieur, that is cowardice. Cross's shoulders slumped. Perhaps. But at least now, it is finished. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by Clara's sobs. Margaret rose, her face pale. So it ends. Years of secrecy, of guilt, and for what? To arrive here, in disgrace and death. Edward Vale spat bitterly. We should have spoken the truth then, instead of listening to you, Margaret, and him. Now Geoffrey's dead, and the rest of us ruined. Poirot lifted a hand. Ruined, perhaps. But not destroyed. The law will take its course with Dr. Cross. For the rest, you must live with memory. Already you have carried it so long, what is left but to confess, and to find peace? He straightened, his eyes gleaming. For justice, Miss Amiss, always comes. It may wait, it may sleep, but it never dies. Later, when the police had taken Dr. Cross into custody and the house lay hushed once more, Poirot stood alone by the fire. He gazed into the flames, his hands folded neatly. So it ends, he murmured. A secret, a friendship, a life. Such is the poison of silence. Ah, mon pauvre Colonel, at least now, your conscience may rest. He smoothed his moustache, his eyes thoughtful. For Hercule Poirot, he has restored the balance. And that, it is enough. The clock chimed softly in the hall. Poirot turned, composed as ever, ready to leave Waverly Grange behind. Another case concluded, another truth revealed. The little grey cells had triumphed once again.